The blood dripped from Abigail Everett's lip as she stared defiantly into the eyes of Samuel Warren, the wealthiest cattle baron in Montana Territory's Grass Valley. It wasn't the first time she had endured a beating for speaking her mind, but this time it had happened in broad daylight on the town's main street, with half the population watching in stunned silence. "You'll learn your place, woman," Samuel snarled, adjusting his expensive suit jacket as he turned to leave. "No schoolteacher talks to me that way in my own town." Abigail wiped the blood from her mouth with the back of her hand, refusing to lower her gaze even as her body trembled. "This isn't your town, Mr. Warren, and I'll speak truth to any man who threatens to close the school because his son was rightfully disciplined." Samuel's face contorted with rage, and he raised his hand again, but before he could strike, the unmistakable sound of a revolver being cocked froze him mid-motion. "I believe the lady's made her point," came a deep voice from behind them. "Touch her again, and it'll be the last thing your hand ever does." Abigail turned to see a tall figure silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. A dusty black hat shadowed his face, but she could make out the glint in his blue eyes as he kept his colt trained steadily on the cattle baron. It was 1878, and Grass Valley, Montana, was about to witness the beginning of a story that would be told for generations. The stranger stepped forward, moving with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. His worn leather duster carried the dust of long trails, and the stubble on his jaw suggested several days of hard riding. "I don't know who you think you are, Mr. Samuel Warren spat, but you've just made a powerful enemy." The stranger didn't blink. "Wouldn't be the first time. Now apologize to the lady and be on your way." Warren glanced around at the gathered crowd, calculating his odds. With a final venomous look at Abigail, he turned and stalked away, his two ranch hands following reluctantly behind. Only when Warren had disappeared into the saloon across the street did the stranger holster his weapon. He turned to Abigail, and she got her first good look at him, ruggedly handsome with features weathered by sun and wind, but not much older than her 24 years. "You all right, madam?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Abigail straightened her back, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "I'm fine, thank you, Mr. Nathaniel Price." He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair. "Most folks just call me Nate." "Miss Abigail Everett," she replied, extending her hand formally despite her split lip and the dirt on her once pristine blue dress. "I teach at the schoolhouse." "I figured as much." His smile was slight but genuine as he accepted her hand. "You've got the bearing of an educator." "Is that a compliment, Mr. Price?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "It is. My ma was a teacher back in Missouri, toughest woman I ever knew." He glanced at her injuries. "Until perhaps now." The gathered townsfolk had begun to disperse, though Abigail noticed they were still watching from doorways and windows. "Let me help you to the doctor," Nate offered, gesturing toward the small building at the end of the street. "That won't be necessary," Abigail insisted. "I've dealt with worse." Nate studied her for a moment. "I don't doubt that, Miss Everett, but a split lip can fester if not cleaned properly. Besides, I reckon it might be best if you weren't alone when Warren's temper cools enough for him to start thinking about revenge." Abigail hesitated, then nodded. Her hand went instinctively to the small locket at her throat, a nervous habit she'd developed over the years. "Very well, Mr. Price, though I should warn you that associating with me might not be wise for a newcomer to Grass Valley. Samuel Warren owns half the county and employs most of the other half." Nate shrugged. "I've never been known for my wisdom, Miss Everett, just my timing." He offered her his arm. "And right now, my timing says we should get you to that doctor before the bleeding starts again." As they walked down the dusty main street, Abigail was acutely aware of the eyes following them. She had come to Grass Valley 2 years earlier, seeking independence after her parents' deaths had left her alone in the world. Teaching had given her purpose, but her refusal to bend to Samuel Warren's will had made her life increasingly difficult. "You're new to town," she said, stating the obvious to break the silence. Nate nodded. "Just rode in this morning. Was planning to stay only long enough to resupply before heading north." "What's north?" Abigail asked, curious despite herself. "Work, hopefully. I've been hired to help establish a new ranch near the Canadian border. The owner's looking for experienced hands." "You're a cowboy, then?" He smiled slightly. "Among other things. I've done my share of droving, breaking horses, even some scouting for the army after the war." They reached the doctor's office, a modest clapboard building with a small sign reading Dr. James Thompson, physician and surgeon. The door opened before they reached it, revealing a portly man with kind eyes and graying whiskers. "Miss Everett," he sighed, shaking his head. "I heard there was trouble. Come in, come in." Inside as Dr. Thompson gently cleaned her wounds, Abigail found herself explaining the day's events to Nate. "Warren's son, Richard, is 16 and thinks his father's money places him above the rules. He was bullying a younger child, and when I intervened, he became belligerent. I kept him after school and assigned additional lessons." She winced as the doctor applied antiseptic to her cut. "Samuel Warren arrived at my classroom an hour later, demanding I rescind the punishment. When I refused, he threatened to have the school board dismiss me." "The boy needs discipline," Dr. Thompson murmured as he worked. "You did right by standing your ground, Abigail." "Perhaps," she said, "but I could have been more diplomatic. When he threatened the school, I told him that his money couldn't buy everything, especially not respect or intelligence for his son." She sighed. "I knew it would provoke him, but I couldn't stop myself." Nate leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "So he waited until you left the school and confronted you publicly?" "Yes, he wanted to make an example of me." Abigail's voice hardened. "He's used to getting his way in this town." Dr. Thompson finished his work with a small bandage. "There you are. The cut isn't deep, but that bruise on your cheek will take time to fade." Abigail touched her face gingerly. "Thank you, doctor." "What do I owe you?" The doctor waved her off. "Nothing this time. Just promise you'll be more careful. Warren's not a man to cross lightly." "I can't promise that," she said quietly. "Not if it means allowing him to bully my students or dictate how I teach." Nate watched her with a thoughtful expression. When they left the doctor's office, the sun was setting, painting the mountains to the west in brilliant gold and crimson. "Where are you staying, Mr. Price?" Abigail asked as they stood on the boardwalk. "Haven't sorted that yet. Is there a decent hotel in town?" "The Grass Valley Inn is comfortable enough," she said, pointing down the street. "Though I should warn you, the owner, Mr. Finch, is Samuel Warren's brother-in-law." Nate nodded. "Noted. And you, Miss Everett, will you be safe tonight?" The question caught her off guard. Few in Grass Valley showed concern for her welfare these days. "I have a small house behind the schoolhouse. It's provided as part of my position. Mind if I walk you there? Just to be certain Warren hasn't left any surprises." Abigail hesitated only briefly. "That would be kind, thank you." As they walked through town, Nate kept a watchful eye on the surroundings, particularly the saloon where Warren had disappeared. The cattle baron's 2 ranch hands loitered outside, watching them pass with undisguised hostility. "Friends of yours?" Nate asked dryly. "Hardly. The taller one is Illy Tucker. He's Warren's foreman and does most of his dirty work. The other is Jake Miller, newer to the ranch but just as unpleasant." They continued past the general store, the assayer's office, and the small church that doubled as the schoolhouse during weekdays. Behind it stood a modest cabin with a small garden just beginning to bloom with spring flowers. "This is me," Abigail said, stopping at the gate. "Thank you for your assistance today, Mr. Price." "Nate," he corrected her, "and it was no trouble." He glanced around the property, his experienced eyes assessing potential vulnerabilities. "You have a lock on that door." "Yes, though I rarely use it. Grass Valley was quite peaceful before." She trailed off. "Before you stood up to the local tyrant," Nate finished for her. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small revolver. "Do you know how to use one of these?" Abigail eyed the weapon warily. "My father taught me the basics years ago, but I've never had cause to own one." "Take it," he insisted, "just until things cool down. It's a simple 5-shot, easy to handle." She accepted the gun reluctantly, its weight unfamiliar in her hand. "I'm not sure this is necessary." "Better to have it and not need it," Nate said. "I'll check on you tomorrow before I head out. Lock your door tonight, Miss Everett." As he turned to leave, Abigail called after him. "Why did you help me today? You don't know me. You don't know this town or its conflicts." Nate looked back, his expression serious in the gathering dusk. "My pa used to say you can judge the character of a place by how it treats those who stand against injustice." He gestured toward her bruised face. "Grass Valley didn't make a very good impression today." With that, he tipped his hat and walked back toward the main street, leaving Abigail standing at her gate with the revolver in her hand, and a curious feeling that her life had just irrevocably changed. Inside her cabin, Abigail lit the lamps and moved to the small mirror on her dresser. The bruise on her cheek had darkened, and her lip was swollen despite the doctor's care. She touched the injuries gently, anger rising again at the memory of Warren's smug face as he'd struck her. She placed Nate's revolver on her bedside table, torn between gratitude for his concern and irritation at the implication that she needed protection. For 2 years, she had managed on her own in Grass Valley, building a reputation as a dedicated teacher, despite growing opposition from the Warren family and their allies. After changing into her nightgown and robe, Abigail sat at her small desk to prepare the next day's lessons. She was determined not to let the incident disrupt her students' education. Yet concentration proved difficult as her mind kept returning to the tall stranger who had intervened on her behalf. There was something in Nathaniel Price's manner that intrigued her, a quiet confidence that seemed born of hardship rather than privilege. Unlike the local men who either feared Warren or sought his favor, Nate had stood his ground without bravado or hesitation. A sharp knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Abigail froze, listening. It came again, more insistent this time. "Miss Everett, it's Sheriff Daniels." Relieved, she moved to open the door, then remembered Nate's warning and the revolver. She tucked it into her robe pocket before unlocking the door. Sheriff Thomas Daniels stood on her porch, looking uncomfortable in his official capacity. A man in his 50s with a perpetually harried expression, he had always been cordial to Abigail but rarely decisive in matters concerning Samuel Warren. "Evening, Miss Everett. Heard there was some trouble in town today." His eyes fixed on her bruised face. "You could say that," she replied coolly. "Though I'm surprised you're only hearing of it now. Half the town witnessed Mr. Warren's assault." The sheriff shifted his weight. "Yes, well, I've been out at the Carson place all day. Their boy went missing." He cleared his throat. "Look, I need to ask what happened. Get your statement." Abigail recounted the events, watching the sheriff's expression grow increasingly troubled. "And this newcomer, this Price fellow, he pulled a gun on Samuel Warren?" Daniels asked, scribbling notes. "He intervened to prevent further harm," Abigail corrected. "Mr. Warren was about to strike me again." The sheriff pocketed his notebook with a sigh. "Miss Everett, you're a fine teacher, and what happened today wasn't right, but Samuel Warren has influence in this territory." "Considerable influence. Are you saying he's above the law, Sheriff?" "I'm saying life can get mighty difficult for those who cross him, and for those who enforce the law against him." He looked tired suddenly. "I'll speak to him, but I'd advise you to consider some form of reconciliation." "For your own sake." Abigail straightened her spine. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I won't apologize for doing my job or standing up for my students." Daniels nodded as if he'd expected this response. "Just be careful, Miss Everett. And tell your friend Price to watch himself if he's planning to stay in town. Warren doesn't forget slights." He tipped his hat and departed, leaving Abigail with a growing sense of isolation. She locked the door firmly behind him and returned to her lesson plans, though her heart wasn't in it. Eventually, she retired to bed, placing the revolver within reach as Nate had suggested. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of confrontation, and the memory of intense blue eyes beneath the brim of a dusty black hat. Morning arrived with the cheerful indifference of spring sunshine, birds singing outside her window as if the previous day's violence had never occurred. Abigail dressed carefully, selecting a high-necked blouse that partially concealed the bruising, though nothing could hide the swelling around her lip. When she opened her door to leave for the schoolhouse, she found a small package on the porch, a jar of what appeared to be some kind of salve, wrapped in brown paper with a note. "For the bruising, my mother's recipe. N.P." Touched by the gesture, Abigail applied some of the pungent ointment to her injuries before gathering her books and walking the short distance to the schoolhouse. She arrived early as usual, lighting the stove and preparing the classroom for her 12 students, whose ages ranged from 6 to 17. The children began arriving shortly after 7:30, their curious eyes immediately drawn to her face despite her efforts to act normally. Young Emily Carson, 8 years old and painfully shy, approached her desk hesitantly. "Miss Everett, Pa says you got hurt standing up for what's right." Her small voice trembled. "Is that true?" Abigail knelt beside the child. "I believe in treating everyone fairly, Emily. Sometimes that isn't easy, but it's always important. Like when you made Richard Warren stop pulling my brother's hair, exactly like that." Abigail squeezed the girl's hand. "Now, let's get ready for our arithmetic lesson, shall we?" As the school day progressed, Abigail noticed that several students were missing, all from families with ties to the Warren ranch. By lunchtime, it was clear that Samuel Warren had begun his retaliation. The afternoon brought confirmation when School Board Chairman Harold Finch appeared at her classroom door. "A word, Miss Everett," he requested, gesturing to the churchyard outside. Abigail assigned her students independent reading and stepped outside, bracing herself for what was to come. "The board has received complaints," Finch began without preamble. "Serious complaints about your conduct and teaching methods." "From Samuel Warren," Abigail stated flatly. "From several parents," Finch corrected, though his averted eyes told her the truth. "There are concerns about favoritism, excessive discipline, and inappropriate subject matter." Abigail's hands clenched at her sides. "That's absurd. I've never shown favoritism except to reward genuine achievement, regardless of family name or status. As for discipline, I hold all students to the same standards of behavior." "Nevertheless," Finch continued, "the board feels it would be best if you took a leave of absence while these concerns are investigated. You're suspending me because I wouldn't let Richard Warren bully younger children." Abigail's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. "This is nothing but Samuel Warren using his influence to punish me." Finch had the grace to look uncomfortable. "The decision has been made, Miss Everett. You'll continue to receive your salary for 2 weeks, by which time the board will determine whether your position will continue. And my home, the teacher's cabin, is part of my compensation. You may remain there during the investigation period," Finch replied stiffly. "Though I would advise you to consider alternative arrangements in case the board's decision is not in your favor." Abigail fought back tears of frustration. "Who will teach the children in my absence? Mrs. Finch has graciously agreed to step in temporarily. She taught briefly in Denver before our marriage." The unfairness of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but Abigail refused to break down in front of Finch. "I see. May I at least finish today's lessons and explain my absence to my students?" Finch shook his head. "Mrs. Finch will arrive after lunch to take over. You may gather your personal belongings now." He hesitated, then added more softly, "For what it's worth, Miss Everett, not everyone on the board agrees with this action, but Samuel Warren's influence is substantial." Abigail returned to the classroom with her head high, though her heart was breaking. She announced to her confused students that she would be taking a brief leave, and that Mrs. Finch would be their teacher in the meantime. The younger children looked bewildered, while the older ones exchanged knowing glances. They understood what was happening, even if they couldn't openly acknowledge it. As she gathered her books and teaching materials, 12-year-old Thomas Bailey approached her desk. "It's because you stood up to Mr. Warren, isn't it?" he asked quietly. Abigail hesitated, torn between honesty and propriety. "Sometimes adults disagree about how things should be done, Thomas. That doesn't mean either side is entirely right or wrong." The boy's face showed he wasn't convinced. "My pa says Mr. Warren thinks he owns this town, says it's not right, but nobody stands against him 'cause they're scared." "Your father sounds like a wise man," Abigail replied carefully. "But remember, Thomas, there are many ways to stand for what's right. Sometimes it means speaking out, and sometimes it means working quietly to make things better in ways others might not notice." She finished collecting her belongings just as Meredith Finch arrived, a thin woman with a perpetual expression of mild distaste. Their exchange was brief and cold, and Abigail left the schoolhouse feeling as if she'd been exiled from her own kingdom. The walk back to her cabin seemed longer than usual, the spring sunshine mocking her dark mood. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the figure sitting on her porch until she was nearly at the gate. Nate Price stood as she approached, his expression darkening as he read the devastation on her face. "What's happened?" he asked without preamble. Abigail explained the situation as they entered the cabin, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "So you see, Mr. Price, your assistance yesterday, while gallant, has only accelerated my inevitable conflict with Samuel Warren." "There was nothing inevitable about a man striking a woman in broad daylight," Nate countered, his voice hard. "Warren's the one who escalated matters, not you, perhaps, but the outcome remains the same." She set her books down on the table with deliberate care. "I'll likely lose my position, my home, and the work I love, while Samuel Warren continues to rule Grass Valley unchallenged." Nate paced the small room, his frustration evident. "There must be something that can be done. Have you spoken to the sheriff? Sheriff Daniels visited last night. He's sympathetic, but unwilling to challenge Warren's influence." Abigail sighed. "Most people in this town depend on the Warren Ranch in some way for employment, for business, for loans. Few can afford to take my side openly. What will you do now?" Nate asked, stopping his pacing to look at her directly. Abigail touched her locket, drawing strength from the familiar gesture. "I have some savings, enough to last until I can secure another teaching position, though finding one mid-term will be difficult." She attempted a smile. "Thank you for the salve, by the way. It seems to be helping." Nate nodded absently, his mind clearly working on the problem. "I was planning to leave today, but I think I'll stay a bit longer." "That's not necessary," Abigail protested. "You have work waiting in the north, and my situation is not your concern." "I disagree," he said simply. "I've seen men like Warren before, men who mistake wealth for worth and power for right. Someone needs to stand against them, or they keep taking more. And you've appointed yourself my champion." There was a hint of challenge in her voice. Nate's expression softened. "No, Miss Everett, you're clearly capable of fighting your own battles, but every fighter needs someone in their corner, and right now, your corner looks mighty empty." Before Abigail could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see a group of riders approaching Samuel Warren at the front, flanked by Ellie Tucker and 4 other ranch hands. Their expressions suggested this was not a social call, expecting visitors. Nate asked grimly, moving toward the door. Abigail felt a chill of fear but kept her voice steady. "No, but I'm not surprised. Warren likes to press his advantage." "Stay inside," Nate said, his hand moving to his holstered revolver. "This doesn't need to involve you directly." "It's my home they're approaching," Abigail countered, following him to the door. "And it's me Warren wants to intimidate. I won't hide." Nate gave her a long look, then nodded slightly. "Stubborn," he murmured, but there was something like admiration in his tone. "Stay behind me, at least until we know their intentions." They stepped onto the porch together as Warren and his men halted their horses at the gate. The cattle baron's face darkened at the sight of Nate. "You're still in my town, I see," Warren called out. "That's unfortunate for you, mister." "Last I checked, Grass Valley was part of Montana territory, not Warren territory," Nate replied evenly. "What brings you and your men to Miss Everett's home?" Warren dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men. "I've come to have a civilized conversation with our schoolteacher about her future in this community. A conversation that doesn't concern drifters or gunslingers." "Any conversation that involves 6 armed men against 1 woman doesn't sound particularly civilized to me," Nate said, his hand still resting near his gun. Abigail stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on Nate's arm. "What do you want, Mr. Warren?" "I've already been removed from my position pending the board's investigation, an investigation you instigated with false complaints." Warren smiled thinly. "I'm here to offer you a way out of your predicament, Miss Everett. A gesture of goodwill, if you will." "I find that hard to believe," Abigail replied coldly. Nevertheless, Warren straightened his expensive vest. "I'm prepared to withdraw my complaints to the school board and support your reinstatement on 2 conditions. And those would be: first, a public apology for your disrespect and inappropriate discipline of my son." Warren's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Second, your agreement to accommodate certain adjustments to the school curriculum." Nothing drastic, just a more practical focus for students who will be working the land rather than attending universities back east. Abigail understood immediately. "You want me to stop teaching advanced subjects to the children of farmers and ranchers who work for you, to limit their opportunities for advancement beyond Grass Valley. I want you to prepare them for the life they'll actually lead," Warren countered smoothly. "Not fill their heads with ideas that will only lead to disappointment." "Or competition for your son," Abigail added, her voice sharp. "Or challenges to your control of this valley's future." Warren's facade of civility slipped slightly. "My offer stands for 24 hours, Miss Everett. Accept and you keep your position, your home, and earn my goodwill. Refuse." He let the threat hang in the air. "And if she refuses?" Nate asked quietly. Warren's attention shifted to him, eyes cold. Then not only will she lose her position permanently, but I'll ensure no school in Montana territory hires her. My influence extends beyond Grass Valley, Mr. Price. Nathaniel Price, Mr. Price. Warren nodded as if committing the name to memory. As for you, I suggest you continue your journey northward without delay. Grass Valley has a way of becoming unwelcoming to those who interfere in local matters. Ellie Tucker and the other ranch hands shifted in their saddles, hands moving casually toward their weapons. The threat was unmistakable. Abigail stepped fully in front of Nate, her chin raised despite the fear coursing through her. I don't need 24 hours, Mr. Warren. My answer is no. I won't apologize for doing my job, and I certainly won't limit my students' education to suit your desire for control. Warren's face hardened. Pride, Miss Everett, is a luxury few can afford, especially those in your position. Perhaps, she acknowledged. But integrity is not a luxury, it's a necessity, regardless of one's position. You've made your choice then. Warren remounted his horse in a fluid motion that belied his age. I'll expect you to vacate the teacher's cabin by week's end. The school board will be notified of my decision to withdraw my son and several other students from the school entirely, which will, regrettably, make your position financially untenable for the town. He tipped his hat mockingly. Good day, Miss Everett, Mr. Price. With a sharp gesture to his men, he turned his horse and rode away, the others following in tight formation. Only when they had disappeared down the path toward town did Abigail release the breath she'd been holding. Her hands trembled slightly as the full impact of what had just transpired hit her. You didn't have to do that, Nate said quietly behind her. Do what? She asked, turning to face him. Step in front of me. Put yourself between me and their guns. His blue eyes were troubled. That was either very brave or very foolish. I couldn't let you face danger on my behalf, Abigail replied. This is my fight, not yours. Nate studied her for a long moment. You really don't back down, do you, even when it costs you everything? Some things are worth the cost, she said simply. My students deserve a teacher who believes in their potential, not one who limits their horizons to please a man like Samuel Warren. A slow smile spread across Nate's face, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. That's what I admire about you, Miss Everett. Your pride isn't about yourself, it's about what's right. Abigail felt an unexpected warmth at his words. Nevertheless, I've now lost my position and will soon lose my home. Pride won't keep me fed or sheltered. No, Nate agreed, but it might just inspire others to stand with you. He gestured toward the town. Let's find out if Grass Valley has more courage than Warren gives it credit for. Over the next 3 days, Abigail discovered both the depths of Samuel Warren's influence and the unexpected resilience of certain townspeople. The general store owner, Mrs. Lawson, quietly extended credit when Abigail shopped for supplies. Dr. Thompson refused payment for a follow-up examination of her healing injuries. And Thomas Bailey's father, a respected farmer on the valley's eastern edge, publicly offered her temporary lodging at his family's farm once she was forced to leave the teacher's cabin. Nate, meanwhile, had taken a room at the modest boarding house run by the widow Carson, whose son had recently been rescued after wandering too far into the hills. The widow was no friend of Samuel Warren's and made it clear she didn't care about his opinion of her boarders. On the 4th morning after Warren's ultimatum, Abigail was packing her books when a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Emily Carson's older brother, James, standing there nervously. Ma sent me to fetch you, Miss Everett, the boy said breathlessly. There's a meeting at our place. She says it's important you come right away. What kind of meeting, James? Abigail asked, puzzled. Don't rightly know, madam, but there's a lot of folks there. Mr. Price too? Intrigued and somewhat concerned, Abigail grabbed her shawl and followed the boy through town toward the Carson boarding house. As they approached, she was surprised to see several wagons and horses hitched outside the modest two-story building. Inside, the parlor was crowded with people, at least 20 adults and several children. Abigail recognized most of them: farmers, shopkeepers, the blacksmith, even Sheriff Daniels standing uncomfortably near the back. Mrs. Carson bustled forward to greet her. "There you are, Miss Everett. We were about to send another messenger. Come in, come in." Nate stood near the fireplace, deep in conversation with Thomas Bailey's father and several other men. He looked up as she entered, a hint of satisfaction in his expression. "What's happening here?" Abigail asked, overwhelmed by the unexpected gathering. Nate stepped forward. "These good people have some ideas about the future of education in Grass Valley that they'd like to share with you." William Bailey, a tall, weathered man with honest eyes, addressed the room. "Most of us have children who have benefited from Miss Everett's teaching. We don't hold with Warren forcing her out because she expected the same behavior from his son as from our children." There were murmurs of agreement throughout the room. "But what can be done?" Abigail asked, touched by their support but realistic about Warren's power. "The school board has made their decision." "The board controls the public school," Mrs. Carson said with a decisive nod. "But they don't control whether we send our children there, or whether we might support an alternative." Abigail's confusion must have shown on her face because Nate stepped closer to explain. "What Mrs. Carson is suggesting," he said, "is that you establish your own school, independent of the board and Warren's influence." "A subscription school," William Bailey clarified, "where families pay directly for their children's education. Many of us are willing to contribute, even those without school-age children." Abigail was stunned. "But where? We'd need a building, supplies." "My late husband left me this house," Mrs. Carson said firmly. "It's larger than I need, with rooms going unused. The front parlor could be converted to a classroom easily enough. And we've all agreed to contribute what we can," added Mrs. Lawson from the general store. "Books, slates, desks from our homes if needed." "It won't be easy," Sheriff Daniels warned from the back of the room. "Warren won't take kindly to this kind of defiance. He could make life difficult for everyone involved." "He already makes life difficult," the blacksmith, Mr. Dunham, replied gruffly. "Charging more for grazing rights each year, pressuring merchants to extend him credit while he delays payment, using his influence with the territorial government to block the railroad spur that would have given us better prices for our goods." Abigail looked around the room in amazement, realizing that Warren's treatment of her had simply been the final provocation for a community already strained by his domination. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "I'm touched by your support, but I don't want anyone to suffer because of me." "Not because of you, Miss Everett," William Bailey corrected. "Because it's time Grass Valley stood for something more than Samuel Warren's ambitions." The meeting continued for hours as plans were made and responsibilities assigned. By nightfall, they had established the framework for the Grass Valley Independent Academy, with classes to begin the following week in Mrs. Carson's parlor. Families had pledged enough support to provide Abigail with a modest salary and cover basic supplies. As the gathering dispersed, Nate accompanied Abigail back to her cabin through the gathering dusk. "You orchestrated this, didn't you?" she asked as they walked. Nate shrugged. "I may have spoken to a few people, but the sentiment was already there. They just needed someone to suggest that action was possible." "Why would you do this? You were planning to leave for that ranch position in the north." He was quiet for a moment before responding. "Some things are more important than plans." When I saw you stand up to Warren not just once but repeatedly despite the cost to yourself." He trailed off, then continued more softly. "Let's just say it reminded me why I came west in the first place, to find a place where right matters more than might." They reached her cabin and stopped at the porch steps. The evening was mild, stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue sky. "I still have to leave this place by tomorrow," Abigail said, gesturing to the cabin. "Mrs. Carson has a room ready for you," Nate assured her. "And Mr. Bailey offered his wagon to move your belongings in the morning." Abigail nodded gratefully, then hesitated. "What about you, Mr. Price? Will you still head north?" Something shifted in his expression. "I've sent word that I'll be delayed indefinitely." "Grass Valley seems to need an extra hand at the moment." "For the school?" she asked, puzzled. "For whatever comes next," he replied cryptically. "Warren won't accept this challenge without a fight." His concern was prophetic. The very next day, as William Bailey's wagon was being loaded with Abigail's possessions, Samuel Warren appeared with the sheriff and Harold Finch in tow. "This is town property, Miss Everett," Finch declared officiously. "You were instructed to vacate by today, not dismantle the place." "I'm taking only what belongs to me," Abigail replied calmly. "The furniture came with the cabin and will remain." Warren stepped forward, his manner deceptively pleasant. "I understand you're planning to open some sort of private academy, Miss Everett." "A commendable ambition, but perhaps premature." "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. "Simply that operating a school requires certain permissions, licenses from the territorial authority. As a member of the Territorial Education Committee, I feel obligated to ensure all such enterprises meet proper standards." The threat was clear. Warren would use his political connections to block her independent school. Education Committee. Nate had appeared from inside the cabin, carrying a crate of books. "Interesting. I wasn't aware you had such a position, Mr. Warren." Warren's eyes narrowed at Nate's presence. "It's a recent appointment. Governor Potts values my input on regional development matters." "I'm sure he does," Nate replied smoothly. "Just as I'm sure he'd be interested in some of the documents I came across during my time with the Territorial Marshal's office last year." Abigail watched in fascination as Warren's confident demeanor faltered slightly. "What documents would those be, Mr. Price?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Land records, mostly. Specifically, discrepancies in how certain parcels were transferred from public domain to private ownership." Nate set the crate in the wagon with deliberate care. "Nothing that would interest a law-abiding businessman, of course." The tension between the two men was palpable. Sheriff Daniels shifted uncomfortably, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else. "You're bluffing," Warren said finally. "If such documents existed, they would have been acted upon." "They exist," Nate assured him, "and they haven't been acted upon yet because the right people haven't seen them. But that could change, depending on how events unfold here in Grass Valley." It was a standoff, with neither man willing to back down. Finally, Warren turned to Abigail. "You've made a formidable ally, Miss Everett. I hope you understand what you're involving yourself in." He addressed Nate again. "This isn't over, Price. Not by a long shot." As Warren and his companions departed, William Bailey approached from where he had been watching nearby. "What was that about, Nate? Do you really have documents on Warren?" Nate's expression remained impassive. "Let's just say I've learned that men like Warren usually have secrets they'd rather keep buried. Sometimes the suggestion of knowledge is as powerful as the knowledge itself." Abigail studied him with new interest. "You weren't just passing through Grass Valley, were you? You came here deliberately." Nate met her gaze directly. "Yes and no. I was headed north for work, as I said." but I'd heard rumors about Warren's land dealings and was curious enough to take a detour through Grass Valley. A slight smile touched his lips. Finding you standing up to him in the middle of Main Street was unexpected, though. The revelation should have troubled Abigail, the idea that Nate had his own agenda regarding Warren, independent of her situation. Instead, she found herself intrigued by the layers of complexity beneath his straightforward manner. "So you're not just a cowboy," she mused. "I've been many things," Nate acknowledged. "But right now, I'm someone who believes Grass Valley deserves better than Samuel Warren's vision for it." By midday, Abigail was settled into her room at Mrs. Carson's boarding house, and plans for converting the parlor into a classroom were well underway. Word of the confrontation with Warren had spread quickly, adding to the sense of quiet rebellion building in the town. That evening, as Abigail sat on Mrs. Carson's back porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Nate joined her with 2 cups of coffee. "How are you holding up?" he asked, handing her one of the cups. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "It's strange I've lost my position and my home, yet somehow I feel more hopeful than I have in months." "That's because you're fighting back instead of just enduring," Nate observed. "There's power in that, even when the odds seem long." They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping their coffee as the light faded from the sky. Abigail found herself studying Nate's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that suggested he carried burdens he rarely shared. "Why did you really stay in Grass Valley?" she asked finally. "You could have simply passed your information about Warren to the proper authorities and continued north." Nate considered the question, his eyes on the darkening horizon. "I suppose I wanted to see this through. Make sure Warren was held accountable, not just for his land schemes but for how he treats people." He turned to look at her directly. "And I wanted to make sure you were all right." The simple honesty of his answer touched Abigail deeply. "We barely know each other, Mr. Price." "Nate," he reminded her gently. "And sometimes you know enough about a person from their actions to make judgments about their character." His gaze lingered on her face, where the bruises had begun to fade. "You stood your ground when it would have been easier to yield." "That tells me all I need to know." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of mutual respect, deepening into something more complex. Abigail felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee cup in her hands. "What will you do when this is over?" she asked, breaking the intensity of the moment. "Return to your life as a cowboy, or a territorial marshal, I'm not sure," he admitted. "I've spent years moving from place to place, taking whatever honest work I could find, never staying long enough to put down roots." He smiled slightly. "What about you? Will you stay in Grass Valley if your academy succeeds?" "I'd like to," Abigail said, surprising herself with the certainty of her answer. "These people have shown me what community truly means. I want to be part of building something here that outlasts Samuel Warren's influence." Their conversation continued as stars appeared overhead, covering topics from their childhoods to their dreams for the future. Abigail learned that Nate had grown up in Missouri, the son of a teacher and a farmer who had both died in a flood when he was 16. He had fought briefly for the Union during the final year of the Civil War, then drifted westward, working a succession of jobs that had given him a diverse set of skills and experiences. In turn, she told him about her upbringing in Pennsylvania, her father's encouragement of her education despite social pressures for women to focus solely on domestic matters, and her decision to seek independence in the West after her parents' deaths. It was the most open conversation Abigail had experienced in years, and when they finally bid each other good night, she felt as if something fundamental had changed in her life, something beyond the obvious upheavals of the past week. The following days were a flurry of activity as the parlor was transformed into a classroom. Men from the community built simple desks and benches, while women contributed books, slates, and other educational materials. Abigail worked tirelessly to organize the space and prepare lessons for students of varying ages and abilities. Nate made himself useful wherever needed helping with heavy lifting, riding to neighboring communities to spread word about the new academy, even assisting Sheriff Daniels with a minor disturbance that might have escalated without his calm intervention. Samuel Warren, meanwhile, maintained an ominous silence. His ranch hands were noticeably absent from town, and rumors circulated that he had traveled to Helena on business. The respite allowed the academy preparations to proceed unhindered, but Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that Warren was merely regrouping before his next move. On the Sunday before classes were to begin, a community gathering was held at the Baptist church on the edge of town. Reverend Collins, a progressive-minded clergyman who had privately supported Abigail all along, invited her to address the congregation regarding the new academy. Standing before the assembled townspeople, Abigail felt a momentary nervousness that quickly gave way to conviction. "Education is not a privilege for the wealthy or the powerful," she began. "It is a light that should shine for all children, regardless of their circumstances or prospects. In our new academy, we will continue to foster not just literacy and arithmetic, but curiosity, critical thinking, and moral character." She spoke for only a few minutes, but her words resonated with many present. Afterward, several additional families approached to enroll their children, bringing the academy's prospective student count to 22, almost double the number Abigail had taught at the public school. As the congregation dispersed, Reverend Collins drew Abigail and Nate aside. "A word of warning," he said quietly. "Warren returned from Helena yesterday evening. He was seen meeting with his foreman and several strangers at the saloon late into the night." "Strangers?" Nate asked sharply. "What kind of strangers?" The Reverend hesitated. "The kind that wear their guns prominently and don't look local. Mrs. Peterson, who cleans the saloon, overheard enough to be concerned. She said Warren mentioned the academy and your name specifically, Miss Everett." Abigail felt a chill despite the warm spring day. "Does he mean to prevent the school from opening?" "It seems likely," the Reverend confirmed grimly. "Mrs. Peterson said something about making an example and teaching the town a lesson." Nate's expression hardened. "We should warn Sheriff Daniels." "I've already spoken to him," Reverend Collins said. "He promised to keep an eye on things, but—" He sighed. "Thomas is a good man, but he's cautious by nature, and he's alone against whatever Warren might be planning." As they walked back toward town, Abigail noticed Nate scanning their surroundings with heightened alertness, his hand never straying far from his holstered revolver. "You're worried," she observed. "Concerned," he corrected. "Warren's not a man to accept defeat gracefully. And hiring gunmen suggests he's planning something beyond legal maneuvering." "What should we do?" Nate considered for a moment. "Proceed as planned with the academy opening, but we'll need to take precautions. I'll speak with some of the men we can trust, Bailey, Dunham, the others who have supported you. We'll arrange a watch rotation, make sure you and the school aren't left vulnerable." "I won't be intimidated into hiding," Abigail insisted. "That would send exactly the wrong message to the children and their parents." Nate smiled slightly, though his eyes remained serious. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Miss Everett. Your stubbornness is becoming quite predictable." "I prefer to call it determination," she replied primly, then softened. "And I think after all we've been through, you might finally call me Abigail." His smile deepened, reaching his eyes this time. Abigail, then. The day before the academy's scheduled opening dawned clear and mild. Abigail rose early, reviewing her lesson plans one final time before heading downstairs to help Mrs. Carson prepare the classroom for the following day. They were arranging the newly constructed desks when Sheriff Daniels appeared at the door, his expression grave. "Miss Everett, Mrs. Carson." "May I come in?" "Of course, Sheriff," Mrs. Carson replied, gesturing him inside. "What brings you by so early?" Daniels removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "I'm afraid I have troubling news. The Territorial Education Inspector arrived last night, accompanied by Mr. Warren. They're demanding to inspect your academy before you can legally open." Abigail straightened, her heart sinking. "On what grounds?" "Safety concerns, primarily. Building codes, fire hazards, that sort of thing." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "They're waiting at my office now, expecting to conduct their inspection this morning." Mrs. Carson bristled. "This house has stood for 20 years without the territory finding fault with it. It's nothing but Warren's attempt to delay or prevent the academy's opening." "You're probably right," Daniels admitted. "But Inspector Davis has the legal authority to conduct such examinations, and he seems quite determined." "No doubt influenced by whatever Warren offered him," Abigail said bitterly. She took a deep breath, gathering her composure. "Very well, Sheriff. Please inform the inspector that we'll be ready for him in 1 hour." After Daniels departed, Mrs. Carson turned to Abigail with concern. "This isn't good, my dear. Warren wouldn't have brought in an inspector unless he was confident they could find some pretext to shut us down." "I know," Abigail agreed, "but refusing the inspection would only give them more ammunition against us." She glanced around the partially prepared classroom. "Let's finish setting up. If they're going to inspect us, let's at least show them what a proper school looks like." They worked quickly, and Abigail sent word to Nate about the development. He arrived just as they were finishing, his expression grim. "I've spoken with Bailey and Dunham," he reported. "They're alerting the others. Whatever happens with this inspection, we need to be prepared for Warren to escalate matters." Before they could discuss further plans, Sheriff Daniels returned with 2 men, one a portly official in a rumpled suit who could only be Inspector Davis, the other Samuel Warren himself, looking smugly confident in his expensive attire. "Miss Everett," Warren greeted her with false cordiality. "How enterprising of you to attempt establishing your own educational institution. Inspector Davis is here to ensure everything meets territorial standards, for the children's safety, of course." Davis pulled out a notebook and pencil, avoiding direct eye contact with Abigail. "I'll need to examine the entire premises, madam. Building structure, exits, heating apparatus, water supply, sanitary facilities." "Of course, Inspector," Abigail replied calmly. "Mrs. Carson and I will show you everything you need to see." The inspection proceeded methodically, with Davis noting various concerns at Warren's subtle, prompting the stove placement, the width of the doorway, the proximity of student desks to each other. It was clear to everyone that Warren was guiding the process toward a predetermined conclusion. Nate observed silently, his presence clearly unsettling Warren, who occasionally cast suspicious glances in his direction. When Davis began examining the ceiling beams with exaggerated concern, Nate finally spoke up. "Those beams have supported this house through 20 Montana winters, Inspector. They're solid oak, better than what you'll find in most territorial government buildings." Davis flushed slightly. "Nevertheless, I must be thorough in my assessment." After nearly 2 hours of examination, Davis closed his notebook with an air of finality. "I regret to inform you, Miss Everett, that this facility fails to meet several critical safety requirements for educational use. What requirements specifically? Abigail demanded. Davis cleared his throat. Insufficient exit routes in case of fire, inadequate ventilation for a classroom of the proposed size, and structural concerns regarding load-bearing capacity for multiple occupants. That's absurd, Mrs. Carson interjected. This house has hosted gatherings of 30 or more people many times without incident. Social gatherings are different from daily educational use, madam, Davis replied stiffly. The regulations are quite clear. Warren stepped forward, his expression one of feigned sympathy. Perhaps this is for the best, Miss Everett. Running a school is a complex undertaking, requiring proper facilities and, of course, proper oversight. The Territorial Board of Education only wants what's best for the children. Abigail's hands clenched at her sides as she struggled to maintain her composure. And what would you suggest as an alternative, Mr. Warren, since you've effectively eliminated both the public school option and now our independent academy? Well, Warren said smoothly, I've been discussing with Inspector Davis the possibility of establishing a proper private academy in Grass Valley, one funded primarily by myself and other concerned citizens of means, with appropriate facilities and a curriculum focused on practical education. Under your control, Abigail stated flatly. Warren smiled thinly. Under proper supervision, certainly, with teachers who understand their role and the needs of the community. The implication was clear. Warren intended to replace her independent vision with his own restricted version of education, designed to maintain the social hierarchy he benefited from. Inspector Davis cleared his throat again. I must issue a formal prohibition against using these premises for educational purposes until the cited deficiencies are addressed. Violation of this order could result in significant penalties. He handed Abigail an official-looking document, which she accepted without comment. Well, I believe our business here is concluded, Warren said, satisfaction evident in his voice. Good day, Miss Everett, Mrs. Carson. As he turned to leave, Nate spoke again. A moment, Mr. Warren. I wonder if Inspector Davis is aware of your recent land acquisitions along the proposed railroad extension. Warren froze, his back still turned to them. I don't see how that's relevant to today's proceedings. Perhaps not directly, Nate agreed. But it might interest the inspector to know that the same territorial office that employs him is currently reviewing certain irregularities in those transactions. Davis looked confused. What is he talking about, Warren? Nothing of consequence, Warren replied quickly. Just attempts to distract from the matter at hand. Nate continued calmly. I had an interesting telegram exchange with Marshal Holbrook in Helena yesterday. He's quite interested in several documents I've forwarded to him regarding discrepancies in land title transfers, particularly those involving territorial officials who may have been improperly influenced. The color drained from Warren's face. You're bluffing. If you had such evidence, you would have acted on it before now. Sometimes justice requires patience, Nate replied, and the right timing. A tense silence filled the room. Finally, Warren turned back to face them, his expression carefully controlled. Whatever game you're playing, Price, it won't change today's outcome. The academy cannot legally open in these premises. He nodded curtly to Davis. Inspector, we should return to town. After they departed, Mrs. Carson sank into a chair, her face lined with disappointment. What now? The children are expecting to begin classes tomorrow. Abigail studied the prohibition notice, her mind racing. They've only forbidden us from using these premises. They haven't revoked my right to teach. Nate raised an eyebrow. You have another location in mind, A slow smile spread across Abigail's face. "Actually, I do. Reverend Collins mentioned last week that the church is only used for services on Sundays and Wednesday evenings. The rest of the time it sits empty. The church isn't under Warren's influence," Mrs. Carson said, brightening, "and it's certainly been deemed safe for public gatherings." "Exactly," Abigail agreed. "I need to speak with Reverend Collins immediately. If he agrees, we can move our materials to the church today and open as planned tomorrow." Nate grinned. "Warren won't be pleased when he discovers his maneuver has failed." "No," Abigail acknowledged, "which is why we need to be prepared for whatever he might try next." She looked at Nate intently. "You mentioned documents about Warren's land dealings. Was that true or just a bluff?" "It's true," Nate confirmed. "I've been gathering evidence for months as part of an unofficial investigation. Warren's been manipulating land titles along the proposed railroad route, using inside information from territorial officials he's bribed or coerced." "And you've sent this evidence to Marshal Holbrook?" Mrs. Carson asked. "Some of it," Nate replied. "Enough to get his attention, but not the most damning pieces. I've been holding those back in case Warren forced our hand." Abigail considered this information. "So we have leverage, but not enough to stop him immediately." "Exactly. The territorial justice system moves slowly, especially when influential men are involved. But the threat might make him think twice about more direct actions against the academy." With renewed determination, Abigail set out to meet with Reverend Collins while Mrs. Carson and Nate began organizing the classroom materials for transport to the church. Word spread quickly through town about the inspection and Warren's attempted blockade, galvanizing support among families committed to the academy. By late afternoon, a procession of wagons carried desks, books, and supplies to the church, where Reverend Collins had enthusiastically offered the main sanctuary for use as a classroom. The community's response was heartening. More parents arrived to help, bringing additional materials and offering their skills to adapt the church space for educational use. As dusk fell, Abigail stood in the transformed sanctuary, now arranged with neat rows of desks facing the pulpit area that would serve as her teaching station. The stained glass windows would provide colorful illumination during day classes, and additional lamps had been positioned for optimal lighting. "It's better than the parlor," Nate observed, coming to stand beside her. "More space, better light." "And consecrated ground," Abigail added with a small smile. "Warren may not hesitate to threaten me, but even he might think twice about disrupting a church." Nate's expression turned serious. "Don't underestimate him, Abigail. Men like Warren see themselves as above all authority, divine or otherwise." She nodded, acknowledging the warning. "We'll be vigilant, but we will open tomorrow as planned." As they walked back to Mrs. Carson's in the gathering darkness, Abigail was acutely aware of Nate's protective presence beside her. Their relationship had evolved rapidly from stranger to ally to something more complex that she wasn't yet ready to define. "Will you stay?" she asked suddenly. "After Warren is dealt with, I mean." Nate was quiet for several steps before responding. "I've never stayed anywhere long since my parents died. Never found a place that seemed worth putting down roots." "And now?" Abigail pressed gently. He glanced at her, his expression softening in the twilight. "Now I'm beginning to wonder if I've been looking for the wrong things all these years." The opening day of the Grass Valley Independent Academy dawned bright and clear. Abigail arrived at the church early, making final preparations for her students' arrival. By 8 o'clock, children began streaming in 27 in total, more than they had initially expected. Parents lingered, many clearly nervous about potential repercussions from Warren but determined to support the academy nonetheless. Reverend Collins offered a brief blessing, and at 8:30 precisely, Abigail rang the small bell that would become the academy's daily signal to begin learning. The morning passed without incident. Abigail divided the students into groups based on age and ability, assigning independent work to older students while she introduced younger ones to basic reading and arithmetic concepts. The diverse space worked surprisingly well, with different groups occupying separate areas of the sanctuary. At noon, children spilled outside for lunch and play in the churchyard, supervised by several parent volunteers. Nate, who had been keeping watch nearby all morning, approached Abigail as she stepped out for a breath of fresh air. "How's it going?" he asked. "Remarkably well," she replied, smiling. "The children are adaptable. Most see this as an adventure rather than a disruption." "No sign of Warren or his men," Nate reported, though Sheriff Daniels rode by twice, looking concerned. "He's in a difficult position," Abigail acknowledged, torn between his duty and Warren's influence. The afternoon session proceeded as smoothly as the morning, and by 4 o'clock, Abigail was dismissing her students with assignments for the following day. As the children departed with their parents, a palpable sense of accomplishment settled over the improvised school. Abigail was arranging materials for the next day's lessons when the church door opened. She looked up, expecting perhaps a parent with a question, but instead found Samuel Warren standing in the entryway, flanked by his foreman, Ellie Tucker. "Resourceful, Miss Everett," Warren said, his voice deceptively calm as he surveyed the transformed sanctuary. "I underestimated your determination." Abigail straightened, wishing Nate hadn't left to escort some of the younger children home. The prohibition applied only to Mrs. Carson's house, Mr. Warren. "We're operating within the law." "For now," Warren agreed. "But laws can change, particularly when those who enforce them understand where their best interests lie." "Is that a threat?" Abigail asked directly. Warren stepped further into the church, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Let's call it a prediction. This experiment will end, Miss Everett, one way or another." Tucker moved to the nearest desk, casually running his hand along its surface before deliberately toppling it with a loud crash. "Illy," Warren cautioned softly. "Not here." Tucker straightened, his eyes never leaving Abigail. "Just inspecting the furniture, boss. Seems unstable." Warren approached until he stood directly before Abigail. "Pride is a dangerous quality, Miss Everett, especially in those without power to sustain it." Abigail held her ground, though her heart raced. "Is that why you beat me, Mr. Warren? Because my pride offended you? I disciplined you because you forgot your place," he replied coldly. "A mistake you continue to make." "My place is exactly where I'm standing," Abigail said firmly. "Teaching children to think for themselves, regardless of their station or your opinion of their potential." Warren studied her for a long moment, then smiled thinly. "We'll see how long that conviction lasts when the consequences extend beyond yourself." Before Abigail could respond, the church door opened again, revealing Nate with Reverend Collins beside him. Warren turned, his expression hardening at the sight of Nate. "Mr. Warren," the Reverend said with forced politeness, "I wasn't aware you had an interest in our new academy." "Just paying a cordial visit," Warren replied smoothly, congratulating Miss Everett on her creativity. Tucker moved away from the overturned desk, his hand resting near his holstered gun as he watched Nate warily. "I think you've extended your congratulations adequately," Nate said quietly. "Reverend Collins needs to prepare for evening services now." Warren's jaw tightened momentarily before he regained his composure. "Of course, We wouldn't want to interfere with the Lord's work." He glanced back at Abigail. "Remember what I said, Miss Everett. This isn't over." With that, he strode toward the door, Tucker following close behind. As they passed Nate, Warren paused briefly. "You're playing a dangerous game, Price," he said, too low for the others to hear. "When you can't win." "We'll see," Nate replied evenly. "The cards aren't all dealt yet." After Warren and Tucker departed, Reverend Collins hurried to Abigail's side. "Are you all right, my dear? I came as soon as Mrs. Bailey told me Warren was headed this way." "I'm fine," Abigail assured him, though her hands trembled slightly as she righted the overturned desk. "He was just trying to intimidate me." "Did he threaten you?" Nate asked sharply. "Not directly," she answered, "but his message was clear enough. He intends to stop the academy, whatever it takes." The Reverend sighed heavily. "Perhaps we should consider additional precautions. I could speak with some of the men about maintaining a guard during school hours." "That might be wise," Nate agreed. "At least until we can resolve the situation with Warren more permanently." That evening, a meeting was hastily convened at Mrs. Carson's boarding house, attended by the core supporters of the academy, the Baileys, the Dunhams, Mrs. Lawson, and several other concerned parents. Sheriff Daniels arrived late, looking troubled. "Warren's brought in 3 more gunmen," he reported without preamble. "They're staying at the saloon, keeping mostly to themselves for now, but their reputation precedes them. Particularly the one called Matthews. He's wanted for questioning in 2 shootings down in Wyoming territory." "Hired guns," Nate muttered. "Warren's escalating." "What exactly is he planning?" William Bailey demanded. "Surely he wouldn't risk open violence, not even Warren." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "I can't say for certain, but there's talk of enforcing an old territorial ordinance requiring permits for any gathering of more than 20 individuals for regular organized activities." "That's absurd," Mrs. Carson protested. "Church services have never required permits. Religious gatherings are specifically exempted," Daniels explained. "But Warren is arguing that the academy is using the church as a pretext to circumvent educational regulations." Abigail shook her head in disbelief. "He's determined to stop these children from receiving an education he doesn't control." "It's more than that now," Nate said quietly. "You've challenged his authority publicly, and others have rallied to your cause. He can't allow that precedent to stand, not if he wants to maintain his grip on Grass Valley." The discussion continued late into the evening, with various proposals considered and rejected. Eventually, they settled on a practical approach. The academy would continue operating at the church, with armed volunteers maintaining discreet watches during school hours. Meanwhile, Nate would expedite his communication with Marshal Holbrook, hoping to accelerate the investigation into Warren's land dealings. As the meeting dispersed, Nate drew Abigail aside. "I need to ride to Helena tomorrow to speak directly with Holbrook. The telegraph is too limited for what needs to be conveyed, and I don't trust Warren not to intercept messages." "Is that safe?" Abigail asked, concerned. "Warren's men will be watching the roads." "I know alternate routes," Nate assured her, "and I'll leave before dawn. With luck, I can be back within 3 days." Abigail touched his arm, suddenly reluctant to see him go. "Be careful, Nate. Warren clearly sees you as a threat." His hand covered hers briefly. "I've faced worse odds. Just keep the academy running and stay safe while I'm gone." "Don't confront Warren directly if you can avoid it." "I'll try," she promised. "Though, as you've noted, avoiding confrontation isn't my particular strength." His smile warmed her despite her concerns. "That's what I love about you, Abigail. Your pride isn't just stubbornness, it's courage." The words hung between them, both acknowledging the deeper sentiment behind them without directly addressing it. After a moment, Nate continued more practically. Bailey and Dunham will keep watch tomorrow. Trust them and don't take unnecessary risks. Abigail nodded. I'll be cautious, just come back quickly. True to his word, Nate departed before dawn the next morning, taking a seldom-used trail that wound through the hills east of town, before connecting with the road to Helena. Abigail rose early as well, her sleep having been restless and filled with anxious dreams. The academy's second day began smoothly, with students arriving eager to continue their lessons. William Bailey maintained a discreet presence outside the church, his rifle propped casually against the wall as he pretended to repair the fence. Inside, Abigail channeled her worries into energetic teaching, determined not to let her students sense her unease. By midday, she had almost convinced herself that Warren would take no immediate action, that the presence of the community support had given him pause. That illusion was shattered when Sheriff Daniels appeared at the church door during the lunch break, his expression grim. "Miss Everett," he said formally, "I need to speak with you privately." She led him to a corner of the sanctuary away from the curious eyes of students and parent volunteers. "What is it, Sheriff?" Daniels removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands, a gesture she had come to recognize as a prelude to unwelcome news. "I've received a court order from Judge Willis in Helena," he said, producing an official document. "It prohibits the operation of an unlicensed educational institution anywhere in Grass Valley, pending proper approval from the Territorial Board of Education." Abigail took the paper with suddenly cold fingers. "This is Warren's doing." "Almost certainly," Daniels agreed quietly. "Judge Willis and Warren have business connections, but the order appears legally sound." "When was this issued?" she asked, scanning the document. "It's dated yesterday, but Judge Willis is in Helena. How did it arrive so quickly?" The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Special courier. Arrived this morning." "Convenient timing," Abigail observed bitterly. "Just as Nate leaves for Helena." Daniels sighed. "I don't like this any better than you do, Miss Everett, but I'm bound to enforce the court's order. You'll need to dismiss the students and suspend operations until proper licensing is obtained." Abigail's mind raced, seeking any possible recourse. "How long does the licensing process take?" "Normally. Weeks, maybe months. With Warren opposing it, could be indefinitely." She folded the document carefully, buying time to think. "I'll need to inform the parents. Can you give me until the end of today's session? Let the children complete their lessons before we disrupt their education again." Daniels hesitated, then nodded. "Till 4 o'clock. But not a minute longer, or I'll be in violation of the order myself." "Thank you, Sheriff," Abigail said sincerely. "I know you're caught in a difficult position." After he left, Abigail conferred quietly with William Bailey and the other parents present. The news spread quickly among the Academy's supporters, and by the time the afternoon session concluded, a new crisis meeting had been arranged for that evening. As she dismissed her students, Abigail found herself fighting back tears of frustration. Each child's face eager, trusting, full of potential reminded her of what was at stake. This wasn't merely about her pride or Warren's power. It was about the future of Grass Valley itself, about what kind of community it would become. The meeting that evening was larger than expected, held at the Bailey farm to accommodate the crowd. Nearly 40 adults packed the large main room of the farmhouse, their expressions ranging from anger to determination to fear. "We can't just surrender, Mrs. Lawson insisted after Abigail had explained the court order. "These children deserve better than Warren's restricted vision of education. But we can't ignore a legal order, however unjustly obtained," Reverend Collins cautioned. "That would give Warren the pretext he needs for more direct action." What about appealing to the territorial governor? Another parent suggested. Surely he wouldn't support such obvious manipulation of the legal system. Sheriff Daniels, who had arrived late, shook his head. Governor Potts is in Washington until next month. His deputy is unlikely to intervene in what appears to be a routine regulatory matter. The discussion continued in circles, with various proposals considered and rejected. Abigail listened, increasingly convinced that they had reached an impasse. Without Nate's evidence against Warren, they had no immediate leverage to counter his legal maneuvers. As the meeting began to disperse, with only the most committed supporters remaining, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Moments later, the door burst open to reveal Illy Tucker and two of Warren's hired gunmen, their weapons drawn. "Evening, folks," Tucker drawled, his eyes coldly surveying the room. "Quite a gathering you've got here, almost like you're planning something." William Bailey stepped forward, his own rifle in hand. "This is private property, Tucker. You and your friends need to leave." Tucker smiled unpleasantly. "Actually, we've come with a message from Mr. Warren. He's generously decided to resolve this education dispute once and for all." "What are you talking about?" Abigail demanded, moving to stand beside Bailey. "Mr. Warren is prepared to fund a proper school for Grass Valley," Tucker announced. "Complete with a licensed teacher from back east. Construction will begin next month on land he's donating for the purpose." "We don't want Warren's school," Mrs. Carson said firmly. "We want our children taught by Miss Everett without his interference." Tucker's expression hardened. "That's not an option anymore. Miss Everett has been declared unfit for teaching by the territorial board." The decision came through today, signed by Inspector Davis himself. Abigail felt as if she'd been struck. "That's impossible. There's been no hearing, no opportunity to defend myself." "Apparently, your conduct during the inspection was deemed insubordinate and unprofessional," Tucker replied with mock sympathy. "The board found this sufficient grounds for immediate revocation of your teaching privileges." Sheriff Daniels stepped forward. "I've received no notification of such a decision, Tucker, and enforcement would fall under my jurisdiction." "The paperwork's at the office," one of the gunmen said. "Arrived by courier this afternoon while you were out making your rounds." A tense silence fell over the room as the implications became clear. Warren had not only blocked the academy but had now moved to eliminate Abigail's ability to teach anywhere in the territory. "This isn't legal," Abigail said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt. "It can't be. No legitimate board would revoke a teacher's credentials without due process." "Take it up with the authorities in Helena," Tucker suggested with a smirk. "Though I hear travel can be dangerous these days. Lots of desperate characters on the roads." The threat was unmistakable, and Abigail realized with sudden clarity that it wasn't directed just at her but at Nate as well. Warren knew where he had gone and why. "Get out," Bailey ordered, raising his rifle. "You've delivered your message. Now leave my property before I exercise my right to defend it." Tucker assessed the situation, noting that several other men in the room had moved to retrieve their own weapons. With a final mocking tip of his hat, he backed toward the door. "Just wanted to make the situation clear, folks. Save you the trouble of continuing this pointless resistance." His eyes fixed on Abigail. "Especially you, Miss Everett. Pride comes before a fall, they say. Might be time to consider leaving Grass Valley while you still can." After Tucker and his companions departed, the remaining group huddled in urgent conference. "This changes everything," Reverend Collins said grimly. "Warren's not just blocking the academy, he's attacking Abigail personally now. And likely Nate as well," Abigail added, voicing her fears. That comment about dangerous roads wasn't subtle. Sheriff Daniels looked troubled. "I'll check on this supposed teaching revocation. If it's as irregular as it sounds, there might be grounds to challenge it." "But that would take time," Mrs. Carson pointed out. "Time during which our children receive no proper education." "And during which Nate might be in danger," Abigail said, her worry increasing. "Sheriff, is there any way to get word to him? Warn him that Warren might have men watching for him?" Daniels considered this. "I could dispatch a deputy toward Helena, try to intercept him, though if he took an alternate route as he mentioned." "I'll go," offered Thomas Bailey, William's 19-year-old son. "I know these hills better than any of Warren's men. If Mr. Price took the eastern trail, I can catch up to him before he reaches the main road." His father nodded approval. "Take the fast horse and travel light. If you ride through the night, you might catch him before dawn." As plans were made for Thomas's departure, Abigail found herself struggling with a mounting sense of desperation. Warren's tactics had escalated beyond what she had anticipated, and she feared that Nate might be riding into a trap. "You should stay with us tonight," William Bailey told Abigail as the meeting concluded. "If Warren's men delivered threats here, they might visit your room at Mrs. Carson's as well." Abigail nodded gratefully, too concerned about Nate and the academy's future to argue. Mrs. Bailey showed her to a small but comfortable guest room, where Abigail spent most of the night alternating between fitful sleep and anxious wakefulness. Morning brought no relief. Thomas Bailey had not returned, and there was no word about Nate. Abigail spent the day helping on the Bailey farm, grateful for the physical work that temporarily distracted her from her worries. By evening, her concern had deepened into dread. "Something's wrong," she told William Bailey as they sat on the porch after dinner. "Thomas should have returned by now, even if he rode all the way to Helena." Bailey nodded grimly. "I'm thinking the same. I'll gather some men tonight. At first light, we'll ride out to search for him." "I'm coming with you," Abigail said firmly. "I can ride as well as any man, and I know the eastern trail." Bailey seemed about to object, then reconsidered. "Very well, but you'll need to be prepared for whatever we might find." The search party departed at dawn. William Bailey, Abigail, the blacksmith Mr. Dunham, and 3 other men loyal to the academy's cause. They followed the eastern trail that Nate had mentioned, their progress slowed by the need to watch for signs of passage or disturbance. They had ridden for nearly 3 hours when one of the men called out, pointing to a cluster of vultures circling ahead. With growing apprehension, the party urged their horses forward, coming upon a small clearing where the scavenger birds had gathered. To Abigail's immense relief, they found no human remains, only the carcass of a deer, partially consumed by predators. But as they prepared to continue, Mr. Dunham noticed something significant in the soft earth at the clearing's edge. "Tracks," he announced, dismounting to examine them more closely. "At least 5 horses, maybe more. Passed through here yesterday, I judge." "Warren's men?" Bailey asked, joining him. Dunham nodded. 3 of the horses are shod in the distinctive pattern that Warren's blacksmith uses. "I'd recognize it anywhere." He pointed to another set of tracks. "These are different. Could be your son's mount, William." "And Nate might have come this way too," Abigail said, hope mingling with renewed concern. "Can you tell which way they were headed?" Dunham followed the tracks for several yards. "East, still. Toward the junction with the main Helena road." They mounted again, proceeding more cautiously now that they had confirmation of others on the trail. About a mile further on, they came upon clear signs of disturbance: broken branches, disturbed earth, and most alarmingly, what appeared to be bloodstains on a large boulder beside the path. "There was a fight here," Bailey said grimly, examining the scene. "Or an ambush." Abigail dismounted, her heart pounding as she surveyed the area. Her eye caught something partially hidden beneath a fallen branch, a familiar black hat, dusty but unmistakable. "Nate's hat," she said, retrieving it with trembling hands. "He was here." The implications were dire. If Warren's men had ambushed Nate on the trail, he might be seriously injured or worse. And if Thomas had encountered the same group while searching for Nate. "We need to keep following the tracks," Bailey decided. "They lead north now, away from the Helena Road." "North?" Abigail repeated, puzzled. Why would they go north if they intercepted Nate heading to Helena? Dunham, who had been examining the ground more carefully, straightened with a grim expression. "Because they were taking prisoners, not bodies. Look here, drag marks, signs of someone being pulled along, probably tied to a horse." The search continued with renewed urgency, following the northward trail that wound deeper into the rugged country beyond the well-traveled routes. By mid-afternoon, they had reached a region of rocky ridges and isolated valleys, perfect territory for concealment. "Warren owns land up this way," Bailey explained as they paused to rest the horses. "An old mining claim that played out years ago. There's a cabin up there that his men sometimes use during hunting season." "You think that's where they've taken Nate and possibly Thomas?" Abigail asked. Bailey nodded. "It would make sense. Isolated, controlled by Warren, and few people even remember it exists." As they prepared to continue, one of the men who had ridden ahead returned at a gallop. "Riders coming," he reported urgently. 6 or 7, moving fast from the direction of town. "Warren's reinforcements," Dunham muttered. "We need to move now." They urged their mounts up a steep trail that wound along a ridge, seeking a vantage point that would allow them to observe without being seen. From their elevated position, they watched as a group of riders passed below Samuel, Warren himself at the lead, accompanied by Lee Tucker and several armed men Abigail didn't recognize. "They're headed for the cabin," Bailey confirmed grimly. "Whatever Warren's planning, it's happening now." "We're outnumbered," Dunham pointed out, "and likely outgunned." Abigail's mind raced, calculating possibilities and risks. "We need to know what we're facing before we decide on a course of action." "Is there a way to approach the cabin without being seen?" Bailey considered this. "There's a back approach through a narrow ravine. Used it for hunting years ago, before Warren claimed the area. It's difficult going, but it might get us close enough to assess the situation." The next hour was arduous as they navigated the challenging terrain, leaving their horses tethered in a protected gully and proceeding on foot through the increasingly rocky landscape. Eventually, they reached a position overlooking a small, sheltered valley where a crude cabin stood beside a long, abandoned mine entrance. Warren and his men had already arrived, dismounting outside the cabin where 2 armed guards were already posted. From their concealed vantage point, Abigail could see Nate being dragged from the cabin, his hands bound behind him. He appeared battered but conscious, his face bruised and his shirt torn and bloodied. "Thomas is there too," Bailey whispered, pointing to another figure being brought out, his son, similarly bound but appearing less injured than Nate. Abigail watched in horror as Warren approached Nate, speaking words they couldn't hear from their position. Whatever was said, Nate's response prompted Warren to strike him across the face, sending him to his knees. "We have to help them," Abigail said desperately. "They'll kill them both." "We need a plan," Dunham insisted. "Going in blindly will just get us all killed." As they watched, the situation below took an unexpected turn. A heated argument seemed to erupt between Warren and several of his hired men, with animated gestures and raised voices carrying faintly to their position. "They're arguing about something," Bailey observed. "Possibly about what to do with the prisoners." Dunham nodded. Some hired guns will kill for money, but draw the line at cold-blooded murder of men like Thomas who have committed no crime. Warren may be finding his men less accommodating than he expected. The argument continued for several minutes before Warren appeared to concede something, gesturing dismissively. The prisoners were hauled back inside the cabin, and Warren mounted his horse, accompanied by Lee Tucker and one of the gunmen. They rode away, leaving 4 men to guard the cabin. "Warren's leaving?" Abigail asked, confused. "More likely going to establish his alibi," Bailey suggested grimly. "Whatever's planned for Nate and Thomas, he doesn't want to be present when it happens." "But he's left fewer men behind," Dunham pointed out. 4 against our 6 improves our odds considerably. They retreated to formulate a plan, weighing various approaches to rescue the prisoners without risking their lives in the process. Eventually, they settled on a strategy that utilized the abandoned mine entrance beside the cabin as a potential diversion. As dusk approached, they put their plan into motion. 2 of the men circled to positions on opposite sides of the clearing, while Bailey, Dunham, and the 3rd man prepared to create a diversion at the mine entrance. Abigail, despite her protests, was assigned to remain at their observation point with a rifle, providing covering fire if needed. The rescue attempt began with a carefully controlled explosion at the mine entrance, a small charge of blasting powder that Dunham had brought, creating a thunderous boom and cloud of dust that immediately drew the attention of all 4 guards. In the ensuing confusion, Bailey and his companions opened fire from different positions, creating the impression of a larger attacking force. 2 of the guards went down in the initial exchange, while the others sought cover behind the cabin and returned fire. From her elevated position, Abigail could see one guard attempting to circle behind Bailey's position. Taking careful aim with the rifle, she fired, striking the man in the shoulder and forcing him to retreat. The firefight continued for several minutes before the remaining guards, believing themselves outnumbered, called out their surrender. With the situation temporarily under control, Bailey and Dunham approached the cabin cautiously while their companions kept the surviving guards covered. Abigail couldn't contain herself any longer. Descending from her position, she ran toward the cabin, reaching it just as Bailey emerged with his son, whose hands he had untied. "Thomas," she exclaimed in relief. "Are you all right?" The young man nodded, though he looked exhausted. "They ambushed us separately, caught me on the trail yesterday morning, and they already had Mr. Price." "Where is he?" Abigail asked urgently, looking past them into the dimly lit cabin. "Here," came Dunham's voice as he emerged supporting Nate, whose condition appeared worse at close range. Blood matted his hair on one side, and he moved with the stiffness of someone suffering from multiple injuries. Abigail rushed to his side, taking Dunham's place in supporting him. "Nate, what did they do to you?" Despite his battered state, Nate managed a weak smile. "Nothing permanent." Warren wanted information more than he wanted me dead. "Information about what?" "The documents," Nate explained, wincing as they moved toward a fallen log where he could sit. "He knows I sent some evidence to Marshal Holbrook, but not all of it. He wanted to know where I've hidden the rest." "Did you tell him?" Bailey asked, joining them after ensuring his son was truly unharmed. Nate shook his head slightly. "There was nothing to tell. I already sent everything to Holbrook before I left town. The marshal should have it by now." Abigail's breath caught. "So you were bluffing when you told Warren you were still holding evidence back?" "Not entirely," Nate admitted. "I kept copies, hidden where Warren won't find them. Insurance in case the originals mysteriously disappear from the marshal's office." They worked quickly to secure the surviving guards and tend to Nate's injuries as best they could with limited supplies. As night fell, They prepared to return to Grass Valley, fashioning a makeshift stretcher for Nate who, despite his protests, was in no condition to ride. The journey back was slow and arduous, with frequent stops to rest and check on Nate's condition. By the time they reached the outskirts of town the following morning, word of their approach had somehow preceded them, and a crowd had gathered to meet them, mostly supporters of the academy, along with Sheriff Daniels. What happened? The sheriff demanded, taking in the wounded men and their prisoners. I've had reports of gunfire in the hills. William Bailey explained the situation succinctly: Warren's ambush of Nate and Thomas, the rescue, and Warren's apparent plan to eliminate those who threatened his control of Grass Valley. Serious allegations, Daniels said, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely surprised. Warren returned to town last night, claiming he'd been inspecting his northern pastures all day. He's lying, Thomas Bailey stated flatly. He was at that cabin yesterday. He personally interrogated Mr. Price and ordered his men to kill us both once he'd gotten what he wanted, Nate added, his voice strained but clear. These two men can confirm it. He nodded toward the captured guards, who looked decidedly uncomfortable under the sheriff's scrutiny. Sheriff Daniels straightened, seeming to come to a decision. I'll need formal statements from everyone involved, and I'll need to take these men into custody. He gestured to his deputy to secure the prisoners. What about Warren? Abigail asked. Will you arrest him as well? The sheriff hesitated. Accusations aren't proof, Miss Everett. I need evidence that will stand up in court. You'll have it, Nate assured him. Marshal Holbrook should be arriving from Helena by tomorrow. With the documents, I sent him records of Warren's land fraud, bribery of territorial officials, and witness statements regarding intimidation of homesteaders. And now attempted murder, Abigail added firmly. Daniels nodded slowly. If the marshal is indeed coming with such evidence, then yes, I'll arrest Samuel Warren. Dr. Thompson arrived to examine Nate's injuries, determining that while serious, they weren't life-threatening. Cracked ribs, concussion, multiple contusions, he reported. He needs rest and careful monitoring, but he should recover fully. Abigail insisted that Nate be brought to Mrs. Carson's boarding house, where she could help tend to him. As they settled him in a downstairs room to avoid navigating the stairs, she sat beside his bed, relief mingling with lingering fear. You could have been killed, she said softly, once they were alone. Nate reached for her hand, his grip weaker than usual but still reassuringly warm. Occupational hazard of challenging men like Warren. Don't joke about it, Abigail scolded gently. I've been terrified since you left. His expression sobered. I'm sorry for worrying you, but we needed Holbrook to understand the seriousness of Warren's crimes. And does he? Understand, I mean, Nate nodded slightly. He does now. When I reached Helena, I found him already reviewing what I'd sent earlier. The additional evidence I brought convinced him to come to Grass Valley personally. Abigail squeezed his hand. Rest now. We can talk more when you're stronger. But Nate held onto her hand when she would have risen. There's something I need to say, Abigail. Something I realized when Warren's men had me, and I thought I might not make it back. She sat down again, her heart quickening at the intensity in his eyes despite his weakened state. When I first saw you standing up to Warren in the street, I admired your courage, Nate continued. But it's more than that now. Your determination, your unwavering belief in what's right, your willingness to fight for others. He took a shaky breath. I've never met anyone like you. And I don't want to leave Grass Valley, not if it means leaving you. Abigail felt tears spring to her eyes. Are you saying what I think you're saying, Nathaniel Price? A smile touched his bruised lips. I'm saying I love you, Abigail Everett. Your pride, your stubbornness, your courage, all of it." She leaned forward, careful of his injuries, and pressed her lips gently to his. "And I love you, Nate. I think I have since you stood up for me that first day when no one else would." Their moment was interrupted by commotion outside, raised voices, and the sound of multiple horses arriving. Mrs. Carson appeared at the doorway, her expression a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Marshal Holbrook is here," she announced, "with a contingent of deputies. They're at the sheriff's office now." Events moved swiftly after the marshal's arrival. Based on the evidence Nate had provided, and the testimony of Warren's captured men, Samuel Warren was arrested that same day, along with Lee Tucker and Inspector Davis, who had arrived in town apparently unaware of the changed circumstances. The territorial court convened an emergency session in Grass Valley 2 weeks later, presided over by a judge from Missoula with no ties to Warren. The evidence against the cattle baron was overwhelming: systematic fraud in land acquisitions, bribery of territorial officials, intimidation of settlers, and finally, the attempted murder of Nate and Thomas Bailey. Warren's conviction sent shockwaves through Montana territory, particularly among those who had believed his influence made him untouchable. The territorial governor, returning from Washington, issued a formal apology to Abigail for the improper revocation of her teaching credentials, which were immediately reinstated. With Warren's power broken, Grass Valley began a process of transformation. The school board, reconstituted without Warren's allies, invited Abigail to resume her position at the public school. She accepted on the condition that she be given full autonomy over curriculum and teaching methods. Nate, fully recovered from his injuries by summer's end, was offered a position as deputy territorial marshal based in Grass Valley, recognition of his role in exposing Warren's crimes and bringing him to justice. The position would allow him to remain in the community while continuing to work against corruption in the territory. On a warm evening in late August, as the new school year approached, Nate took Abigail on a ride to a hillside overlooking Grass Valley. The town spread below them, peaceful in the golden light of sunset, with new construction visible where Warren's influence had previously stifled development. "It's changing already," Abigail observed as they sat on a blanket, sharing a simple picnic. "The railroad spur will be completed by next spring, the new businesses are thriving, and enrollment for the school is the highest it's ever been." Nate nodded, his arm around her shoulders. "Amazing what can happen when people stand together against intimidation." "It started with you," Abigail reminded him, "standing up for a school teacher who was too proud for her own good." "That's what I love about you," Nate said, turning to face her fully. "Your pride isn't arrogance, it's dignity, the unwillingness to accept injustice or surrender your principles." He reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet box. "Abigail Everett, I came to Grass Valley looking for evidence against a corrupt man. Instead, I found the bravest, most principled woman I've ever known. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Opening the box revealed a modest but elegant ring with a small diamond set in gold. Abigail's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "Yes, Nathaniel Price, I will marry you." As they sealed their engagement with a kiss, the setting sun bathed Grass Valley in warm light, a new beginning for the town and for them, born from the courage to stand against tyranny and the love that had grown in its aftermath. They were married that October in the church that had briefly served as Abigail's classroom, with Reverend Collins officiating and the entire community in attendance. The Grass Valley School flourished under Abigail's direction, and Nate's work as deputy marshal brought a new sense of security and fairness to the region. 2 years later, their family expanded with the birth of their son, James William Price, named after both their fathers. As Abigail held their newborn son with Nate beside her, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, a journey that began with a defiant stand on a dusty street and led to a love that had transformed not just their lives, but an entire community. "What are you thinking?" Nate asked, watching her expression as she gazed at their child. "That sometimes," Abigail replied softly, "pride and courage are the same thing. And sometimes, standing your ground leads you exactly where you're meant to be." Nate leaned down to kiss her forehead. "I wouldn't have it any other way." And as Grass Valley continued to grow and prosper in the years that followed, the story of the schoolteacher who was beaten for being too proud and the cowboy who loved her for it became a cherished part of local lore, a reminder that justice, love, and community could triumph even in the wild and often unforgiving landscape of the American frontier.